It was a quiet afternoon. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the small neighborhood where Charles Turner, an elderly veteran, sat on his front porch. With his gray hair and worn face, he looked like any other old man enjoying a peaceful day. But Charles wasn't just any elderly man. He was a man of history, a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and survived it. His days of service in the military were long behind him, but the scars, both visible and hidden, never left. Charles sat in his rocking chair, a mug of coffee resting on his knee, savoring the calmness of the day. He had fought in wars, lost friends, and seen unimaginable horrors. But here in his little house on the edge of town, he had found peace. His wife had passed a few years ago, and his children lived far away, but he never felt lonely. He had his memories, and that was enough. But as he sat there, the sound of sirens broke through the quiet afternoon air. It was unusual for this neighborhood to get much attention from the police. Charles glanced up, his old eyes squinting against the sun, and saw the flashing lights of several police cars pulling up to his driveway. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. As the cars came to a stop, two officers stepped out. They were young, both in their late 20s, with the kind of swagger that came from not yet understanding the weight of their badge. They approached Charles' porch with a confidence that immediately put him on edge. "Afternoon, sir," one of them said, his tone cold and professional. "We've had a few complaints about noise coming from your property. Mind if we ask you some questions?" Charles set his coffee down and slowly stood up from the rocking chair. His back creaked as he straightened, but his eyes were sharp. He had dealt with difficult people before, both on and off the battlefield, and he wasn't about to let some young officers push him around. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet, the way they approached him made his stomach tighten. "I don't know what you're talking about, officer," Charles replied, his voice low and steady. "I've been sitting here, minding my own business." The officers exchanged glances. "Well, sir," the other officer said, stepping forward with a bit more force in his voice, "there's been a complaint about loud noise. Some neighbors are concerned." Charles' brow furrowed. He had lived in this house for over 30 years, and he knew everyone in the neighborhood. No one had ever complained about him. He wasn't the kind of person to cause trouble, but something about these officers made him uneasy. "I haven't made any noise," Charles repeated. "Maybe you should check with someone else." The first officer looked at his partner, clearly frustrated. "Sir, we're just doing our job. Now we need to make sure everything is in order here. Please cooperate." Charles didn't like the tone. He'd been through enough in his life to recognize when someone was trying to force his hand. He took a slow, steady breath, trying to keep his temper in check. But these young cops weren't backing down. They were pushing, and for some reason, Charles couldn't understand. They seemed determined to make something out of nothing. "Listen, I told you," Charles said, taking a step back toward his chair. "I'm not causing any trouble. I don't need to talk to you about anything." That was when things began to escalate. The first officer, now visibly annoyed, reached out and grabbed Charles' arm, pulling him back as he tried to return to his chair. "I told you to stay put. We're going to check things out, whether you like it or not." The second officer moved forward as well, his hand resting on his taser. "Don't make this more difficult than it has to be, old man." Charles froze. His heart raced, but his face remained calm. He was no stranger to danger. He had faced death countless times during his service, but never like this. Never at the hands of two young officers who didn't know who they were dealing with. "Let go of me," Charles said, his voice firm but controlled. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the blood rushing to his head, and the memories of his military service, the discipline, the training, the toughness, flooded back into his mind. The officers hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by Charles' calm demeanor in the face of their aggression. They hadn't expected this from an old man. The second officer stepped forward, his hand still hovering over his taser. Charles looked up at the two officers, a faint glint of something dangerous in his eyes. He wasn't going to let them push him around, not now, not ever. He had seen too much in his life to be intimidated by anyone. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice colder than before, "you're making a big mistake." But the officers didn't understand. They didn't know who he was, who his son was, or what kind of man they were about to provoke. In their eyes, Charles was just an old veteran, someone who had outlived his usefulness. They had no idea that this quiet old man had seen and done things that would make even the toughest of them shudder. As they moved closer, Charles knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just going to be another minor altercation. Something much bigger was about to unfold. And he hoped for their sake they didn't push him any further. The officers stood in front of Charles, their hands resting just inches from their weapons. They still didn't fully grasp who they were dealing with, and that was their mistake. They were young, brash, and confident in their authority, but they had no idea of the storm they were about to unleash. Charles took a slow, deliberate breath, his hands now hanging loosely at his sides. His heart wasn't racing anymore. Instead, it was as steady as the calm before a storm. He had faced far more dangerous situations during his time in the military, and this was nothing more than a misunderstanding, one that was about to get worse. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the tension in the air. His eyes, though clouded with age, seemed to pierce through the officers, as if seeing right through them. The first officer, the one who had grabbed his arm, blinked in confusion. "Don't play games with us, old man," he sneered. "You're just making this more difficult than it needs to be." Charles shook his head slowly. He didn't need to prove anything to these officers, but he felt a growing sense of responsibility, a need to make them understand. "No, you don't understand. This is bigger than you realize." The second officer, the one with his hand still hovering over his taser, stepped forward and jabbed a finger in Charles' direction. "You need to calm down, or we'll have to take action." Charles glanced down at the officer's hand, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every muscle in his body was screaming to act, to push back, but he didn't. Not yet. He had seen the horrors of war, the violence, the bloodshed, and he wasn't about to add more to it unless absolutely necessary. "Listen," Charles said, his voice more forceful now. "You're making a mistake. I'm just an old man sitting on his porch, trying to enjoy the rest of his days in peace. You don't need to escalate this." The first officer scoffed. "You think we're afraid of an old man?" He took another step forward, his face now inches from Charles' own. The second officer wasn't far behind, his hands still on the taser, ready to act if things got out of hand. Charles didn't flinch. His years of service had taught him how to stay calm in the face of danger, to never give away his emotions. But even he couldn't deny the feeling bubbling up inside him. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something deeper. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for them, because they didn't know who they were pushing. Charles' son, Jake Turner, was one of the most feared men in the world. A Delta Force commander, known for his skill, his precision, and his unshakable resolve. The thought of his son rushing into a situation like this, armed and ready to protect his father, made Charles' stomach churn. Jake didn't need to be involved. He didn't want him to be involved. But these officers had no idea what they were dealing with, and the consequences of their actions were about to unfold. "Stop," Charles said suddenly, his voice now calm and commanding. He took a step back, his hand lifting slightly, almost as if trying to signal for peace. "You don't know who you're dealing with. If you continue this, it won't end well for you." The second officer sneered. "Is that a threat, old man?" Charles' eyes narrowed. "No," he said softly, but with an unmistakable edge. "It's a warning." The officers exchanged glances, both of them now visibly uneasy. The arrogance that had been there moments before began to fade. They had seen things in their short careers, but they had never faced anything like this. Something about Charles, his calmness, his lack of fear, made them realize they had crossed a line. They had been rude, dismissive, and now they were getting a sense that they had made a serious mistake. But it was too late to back down now. Enough, the first officer barked, taking a step back. We'll get this sorted out another way. As the officers turned to leave, Charles watched them go. He could feel the weight of their mistake pressing on him, and he knew things were about to change. The air was heavy with tension, like the calm before a thunderstorm. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Charles slowly turned back toward his house, his gaze falling on the photograph of his son hanging on the wall. It was an old picture, one from before Jake had enlisted in the army. Back when he was just a boy, smiling and carefree, not yet knowing the darkness that lay ahead. But Jake had chosen his path, a path that led him to become one of the deadliest soldiers in history. Now, Charles feared that path was going to collide with his quiet, peaceful life in ways he couldn't control. He could feel the familiar, cold knot forming in his stomach. It wasn't just the police he was worried about. It was the consequences of calling his son. The fear in the officer's eyes had been only the beginning. Jake would come, and with him would come a storm the likes of which no one in this small town was ready for. Charles reached for his phone, his hands steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. His son would have to know. He couldn't protect them from what was coming, but maybe he could protect himself. One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. And as he dialed Jake's number, he knew that what had started as a simple misunderstanding was now the beginning of something much, much bigger. Charles sat down in the worn-out armchair in his living room, staring at the phone in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number. He had never been one to ask for help, especially not from his son. Jake had a life of his own now, one filled with danger, responsibility, and countless enemies. Charles had spent years trying to shield him from the horrors of war, from the pain of loss, and from the darkness that had claimed so many others in their family. But now, there was no other choice. Charles could feel the storm on the horizon, and it was closing in fast. The officers, in their arrogance, had underestimated him, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. It wasn't just about one old man being disrespected anymore. This was about something much larger. A system that had failed, that had gone too far, and now it was coming for him. As the phone rang, Charles' mind flashed back to the years spent raising Jake. He remembered the sound of his son's laughter when he was a child, the pride in his heart when Jake enlisted in the military, and the gut-wrenching pain when he realized the man his son was becoming. Jake had seen the worst the world had to offer and had survived it. But this was different. The phone finally picked up. "Hello." Charles' voice cracked as he heard his son's voice on the other end. "Jake, it's Dad." There was a brief pause. "What's wrong, Dad?" "You don't call unless something's up." I need your help," Charles said, his voice strained. He had never sounded so vulnerable, so desperate. "I didn't want to bother you, but I've gotten myself into something I can't handle." Jake's tone shifted instantly. "What's going on, Dad? Talk to me." Charles glanced out the window, his mind racing. "It's the cops. They came by here, harassed me. I tried to handle it, but they're not letting it go. They don't understand who they're messing with, and I'm afraid." He paused, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "I'm afraid it's about to get worse." Jake's voice grew cold, dangerous. "You're telling me they put their hands on you?" Charles sighed deeply. "Not yet, but it's getting close. I didn't want to get you involved. I don't want you to have to come back here, but I'm telling you, it's bad. They don't know who I am. They don't know who you are." There was silence on the other end of the line. Charles could hear Jake's breathing, slow and controlled. Then finally, Jake spoke, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet fury. "Dad, you're my priority. Always have been. No one touches you. No one. I'll be there soon. You stay inside. Lock the doors. Don't do anything until I get there. Charles let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, he whispered. I'll take care of this, Dad, Jake said, the words filled with a certainty that sent a shiver down Charles' spine. Just hang tight. It's going to be all right. Before Charles could say anything else, the line went dead. His son didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew how to handle situations like this. The call had been short, precise, and to the point. Jake was coming. The storm was about to break. Charles sat back in his chair, feeling a mix of relief and dread. He had wanted to protect Jake from this. He never wanted his son to have to deal with the kind of violence and bloodshed that had defined so many of his years in the military. But now, the truth was unavoidable. It wasn't just about the cops or the small town they lived in. It was about a much larger system, a much deeper rot that had been festering for years. The officers might have been disrespectful, but they weren't the real enemy. It was everything behind them, the bureaucracy, the corruption, the people who thought they could get away with anything just because they wore a badge. Charles' mind went back to the moment when he had tried to warn them. He had tried to de-escalate the situation, to get them to back down. But they hadn't listened. Now they would have to face the consequences. And those consequences would come in the form of a man who was far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. Charles knew Jake better than anyone. His son was not a man who took threats lightly. He was the kind of man who would fight fire with fire, and he would do it with ruthless precision. The Delta Force commander was not someone you wanted as an enemy, especially not when the person he loved was in danger. And that was what Charles was counting on. As he sat in his living room, Charles' thoughts wandered back to the past. He had fought in wars, seen things that no one should ever see. But nothing could prepare him for the feeling that his son would soon be here, not just to save him, but to do what was necessary to protect their family and their name. He had always known Jake was capable of great things, but now he would see just how far that capability would go. Charles stood up and walked over to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. He knew the officers would be back soon, either to try and finish what they had started or to make sure he hadn't done anything to retaliate. But he wasn't worried about them anymore. He had placed his faith in Jake, and that faith was about to be tested in ways that none of them could ever have imagined. Outside, the night was creeping in, and with it, a sense of impending danger. The storm was coming, and Charles could only wait now. He had done everything he could to prepare, but the real battle would come when Jake arrived. That's when the world would truly see the mistake the officers had made. The sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed through the stillness of the night. Charles' heart raced as he stood by the window, eyes scanning the dark road that led up to his house. Every minute felt like an hour, every second stretched to its breaking point. His hands were clenched tightly into fists, knuckles white. The tension was unbearable. In the distance, headlights appeared. At first, they were small dots of light, but they quickly grew brighter and larger as the vehicle drew closer. Charles' breath caught in his throat. It was Jake. His son had finally arrived. Charles moved away from the window and stood in the middle of the living room, his eyes fixed on the door. His mind was racing. Part of him wanted to run out to meet Jake, to throw his arms around him and thank him for coming, for not hesitating to help. But another part of him, a deeper part, felt the weight of the moment. This was not going to be easy. Jake had never been one to shy away from conflict, but Charles knew the kind of man he had raised. Jake wasn't just a soldier, he was a force of nature. The headlights turned into the driveway, and the car came to a halt. Charles could hear the engine rumble before it died. The door slammed shut, and the sound of boots hitting the gravel reached his ears. He didn't have to look to know who it was. There was a pause, and then a knock on the door. 3 sharp raps. The kind of knock that could only belong to a man who had seen it all and wasn't afraid of anything. Charles walked to the door, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to unfold. With a shaking hand, he reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Jake standing there, dressed in dark tactical gear, his expression unreadable. His eyes, those cold, piercing eyes, locked onto his father's with an intensity that made Charles feel both comforted and terrified. "Dad," Jake said simply, his voice low and steady. There was no warmth, no affection in his tone, just the calm, controlled precision of a man who had been through hell and come out the other side stronger. "You okay?" Charles swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I'm fine. But it's not just about me anymore, son. They're coming. I can feel it. They'll be back." Jake nodded, his face a mask of determination. "I know. That's why I'm here." The two men stood in silence for a moment. Charles had always known that Jake was a warrior, someone who had been forged in the fires of battle. But seeing him like this, standing on the doorstep with that quiet, confident presence, made everything feel more real. This wasn't just his son coming to protect him. It was the most dangerous man on the planet coming to deliver justice. "Get inside," Jake said, his voice breaking the silence. "We don't have time for pleasantries." Charles stepped aside, allowing Jake to enter the house. As his son walked past him, Charles couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the room, looking for threats even in the quietest of spaces. Jake had been trained for this, trained to assess, to protect, to strike when necessary. The door closed behind them, and the house felt suddenly smaller, as if the weight of everything that was about to happen was pressing in from all sides. "Have you heard anything?" Jake asked, moving toward the living room. "From the cops." "They're planning something," Charles said, his voice strained. "I don't know what, but I know they're not done yet. They won't stop until they've made their point." Jake's lips tightened into a thin line. "Then we'll make sure they understand theirs." Charles watched as his son paced the room, his movements sharp and deliberate. Every step he took was measured, his mind working faster than Charles could keep up. He had seen Jake in action before, back when he was just a young man with raw potential. But now, Jake was something else entirely. A soldier who had been tested time and again. A man who knew how to survive and how to fight back when the odds were stacked against him. "Dad," Jake said, stopping in front of him. His eyes softened, just for a moment. "I'm not here to hurt anyone unless I have to. But if they come for you again, I won't hold back. You understand." Charles nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. The pride he felt for his son was overwhelming, but so was the fear. Fear not for himself, but for what might happen when Jake unleashed the full force of his training, when he brought the full wrath of the Delta Force down on those who dared to threaten his family. "I understand," Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded and then turned toward the window. "You should get some rest. I'll handle things from here." Charles wanted to argue, to insist that he could help, that he wasn't some helpless old man. But he knew better. This was Jake's world now. The world of violence, of power, and of taking what was rightfully theirs. Charles had spent years trying to protect his son from that world. But now, he saw that Jake was no longer the boy he had raised. He was a warrior, and he was ready to fight for what mattered most. As Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the night for any sign of movement, Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. There was no turning back now. The storm was coming, and there would be no mercy. The quiet night outside seemed to stretch on forever, but Charles knew that soon, everything would change. The world would never be the same again. The hours that followed were a blur. Charles sat in the dimly lit living room, the quiet hum of the house barely breaking the tension that clung to every corner. He couldn't sit still. His mind kept racing back to that moment when Jake arrived. That first look in his son's eyes, so calm, yet full of fire. Outside, the wind howled softly, a chilling reminder that something was about to break. Charles could feel it deep in his bones. The air was heavy, pregnant with the coming storm. Jake stood by the window, his face unreadable. His gaze was sharp, scanning the street outside, but his mind was elsewhere, already anticipating what might come next. He was preparing, always preparing. Charles watched his son in silence, unable to escape the flood of emotions. There was so much history between them, so many moments he wished he could go back and change, but now wasn't the time for regret. They were standing on the edge of something big, something dangerous, and there was no way to avoid it. Suddenly, the sound of tires on gravel broke through the stillness. Jake's head snapped to the side, his posture shifting instantly. There was no mistaking it. Someone was here. "Stay here," Jake whispered, his voice low and firm. Charles opened his mouth to protest, but Jake was already moving. In a few long strides, he was at the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His eyes met Charles for a split second, full of understanding and quiet determination. There was no fear in them. Jake was ready. The door opened with a soft creak, and Jake stepped out onto the porch, his boots making no sound on the wood. The wind whistled around him, carrying with it a feeling of inevitability. Charles could barely breathe, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. A single black SUV had parked across the street, its headlights casting long shadows over the pavement. The engine idled, and the figure that stepped out of the vehicle wasn't a stranger. Charles recognized him immediately. It was Officer Barnes, the same cop who had harassed him earlier in the day. But this time, something was different. Barnes wasn't alone. Two more officers flanked him, both of them armed, their hands resting on their weapons with an air of quiet menace. Jake's eyes flicked over them quickly, sizing them up. His body was still, but every muscle was coiled, waiting for the signal to act. The tension in the air was palpable. Barnes took a step forward, his hands held out in a mock gesture of peace. "Look, we don't want any trouble. We just came to talk," he said, though his voice was strained, as if the words didn't quite match the threat in his stance.